In 1987, a faceless Konami employee named Hideo Kojima would inherit a military-themed game project for the MSX... What? What do you mean we skipped a game? Well, the preview for the last... I already put Metal Gear in, so... Okay, well, what game is it?
No, God! No, God, please, no!
Well, alright, so... In January 1987, Nintendo released Zelda II: The Adventure of Link, a sequel to the hugely successful Legend of Zelda. Often considered the black sheep of the franchise, the game was largely a side-scroller, with more emphasis placed on platforming and swordplay. In a way, it was almost an alternate take on Metroid gameplay, but segmented into separate dungeons strewn across a top-down overworld rather than being one huge interconnected map. The game sees Link working to prevent the resurrection of Ganon and awaken the original Princess Zelda, who had been placed under a sleeping curse centuries earlier. Zelda II is much more linear and rigidly structured than its predecessor, with sections of the map completely walled off until Link obtains the correct item or spell. Link now has a magic meter to cast various forms of magic, from a defense spell to recovering health to increasing his jump height or transforming into a fairy to bypass barriers. In addition to pickups that increase Link's max health and magic, he also gains experience points like an RPG, and upon level up, can choose to increase his attack strength, defense, or magic proficiency. In his quest, Link must return magic crystals to 6 temples in Hyrule to be granted entrance to the Great Palace, where he'll face his greatest foe yet. Despite Adventure of Link being overall shorter than the first Zelda, it may not seem that way because this game is way harder. Remember the last video where I said this? It's difficult, but not infuriatingly so. Every mistake the player makes feels honest. It never feels like the game isn't playing fair. Yeah, well, fuck that this time. Zelda 2 absolutely is unfair a lot of the time. The focus on combat combined with the side-scrolling perspective means you're going to be forced to contend with most every enemy you encounter in this game, meaning there's a lot more room to screw up and take damage, and enemy attack patterns also tend to be fairly erratic and unpredictable, and hitboxes are weird and inconsistent. But combat isn't going to be the main threat this time, really. The platforming is often just as treacherous. Basically, any jump in this game is performed over bottomless pits, and there are so many times in Zelda 2 where I was jumping over a pit, only to be hit by a projectile from off-screen in midair, falling to my death, and losing a life. Oh yeah, there are lives in this game, by the way. You start with 3, and while there are a few 1-ups hidden across the overworld, there's no way to get any more until you've maxed all your EXP. Every game over sends you back to the starting area, and while you retain any items and levels gained in the interim, you still have to make the trek back to wherever you died if you want to try again. The difficulty curve is also all over the place. The dungeons themselves do seem to get proportionally harder the further you go, but it's the moments between each dungeon that feel off. After the first temple, you're made to trek through the labyrinthine Death Mountain, a maze-like series of caves filled with plenty of enemies and bottomless pits to contend with, and this is easily the longest and most difficult stretch of overworld traversal in the game. And it happens an hour in. It feels like an endgame segment was placed at the beginning, and if they had swapped the locations of Death Mountain and the mountain maze from later, the difficulty balance would feel a lot more natural and gradual. Placing Death Mountain so early into the game, when the player is underleveled and under-equipped, is a recipe for disaster, with the only reasonable tactic being to grind EXP for potentially hours beforehand, which is never elegant game design. It's also worth pointing out that getting a game over is the only way to save your game without using an obscure button combination on a second controller, and saving the game will still count as a game over on your save file record for those who care about that sort of thing. Like me. Zelda 2 is a game I could see some people really enjoying, like people who enjoy difficult games. But for me, someone who is a perfectionist and completionist in games, even if it's detrimental to my own enjoyment, this is the single most infuriating game I've ever played. I was absolutely determined to get that perfect 000 save file, which meant playing the whole game without ever saving or getting a game over, and I never once actually pulled it off. At least not without cheating. After beating the game legitimately once, I ended up using an action replay to give myself infinite lives on the next playthrough, and even then the game ended up freezing right at the final boss, so I had to do that all again anyway. So my advice, if you play Zelda 2, know when to draw the line. If you don't give a shit about game overs, there can be a lot to like here. The focus on combat can be genuinely pretty thrilling. Certain enemies will fire projectiles or swing their weapons high or low, and you need to react accordingly to block their hits, as well as attack high or low yourself to get past their shields. The game is also structured more like an RPG, with objectives given by NPCs that tell you where and how to progress. But my big issue with the game design here are the handful of moments where you have to step on specific unmarked tiles on the overworld map to find the next NPC or item you need. And these are things I can imagine being really annoying progress blockers if you don't already know where to look. Zelda 2 is probably the worst of the mainline Zelda series, or at the very least, the worst of the 2D Zeldas. I know that it introduced things like the magic meter to the franchise, but it's definitely deserving of its black sheep status. If you're on the fence about this one, I'd say you can skip it. Some may appreciate the challenge the game provides, but more casual players are definitely going to be turned off by its relentless difficulty. Okay, so where was I? In 1987, a faceless Konami employee named Hideo Kojima would inherit a military-themed game project for the MSX2, a gaming computer released in Japan and Europe. Kojima had originally sought a career in filmmaking, but eventually, and somewhat begrudgingly, joined Konami in the early 1980s. Due to his lack of programming knowledge or experience in game design, he was typically given more supervisory roles than directly creative ones, with his first project as assistant director on a game called Penguin Adventure. Kojima had initially hoped to work on NES titles, and found the MSX2 to be too restrictive in comparison, so when he joined this military game project, he quickly caught on to the problems facing the team. To name a few, the MSX2 wasn't capable of screen scrolling like the NES. It had a more limited color palette. It could only generate a small number of moving sprites at once. But Kojima came up with a concept that would not only work within these limitations, but be able to kind of treat them as strengths. Keeping the military theme, Kojima decided to stray the project away from straight-up action and make a game about avoiding combat. Inspired by the film The Great Escape, Kojima's first instinct was to make a game about prisoners of war working together to escape their captors. But this idea was once again held back by the MSX2's limitations, as playing as multiple characters simply wouldn't be viable on the console. So instead, he made the main character of the game a single soldier, given the codename Solid Snake, inspired by Snake Plissken from Escape from New York. Snake would be tasked with infiltrating enemy lines to stop the construction of a new weapon of mass destruction. This game would be called Metal Gear. Metal Gear sees Soldier Solid Snake, a rookie member of the US Special Black Ops Unit Foxhound, called into action to infiltrate the Fortress Nation, whatever that is, of Outer Heaven in South Africa, after communications with fellow Foxhound member Gray Fox went dark. Snake's mission is to investigate Gray Fox's disappearance, and if possible, complete Fox's original mission of incapacitating the new nuclear weapon Outer Heaven is rumored to be developing, the titular Metal Gear. Snake is sent into his mission alone and unarmed, with the goal of remaining as clandestine as possible within Outer Heaven. Along the way, he'll procure weapons and equipment to aid in his mission, as well as recover various prisoners of war that Outer Heaven is keeping captive, who oftentimes provide Snake with tips as gratitude. Every 5 hostages the player rescues adds a star to his military rank, which increases his max health and how many bullets he can carry. Being the first game to revolve around stealth and avoiding combat, Metal Gear would lay the groundwork for future stealth games, such as the fact that the player character is actually pretty fragile, all things considered. While not completely helpless, getting spotted is always a stressful situation, as the player will be outnumbered by enemies who will instantly swarm them. Tactics in Metal Gear are less about directly engaging the enemy in gunfights, and more about ambushing and outsmarting them before they even know you're there. Snake will eventually procure a fairly sizable inventory of gadgets and explosive weapons that can be used to catch enemies off guard, as well as use a submachine gun to cover wide areas, but if all else fails, he can always just settle things with his fists. While certain areas can initially seem daunting due to cramped level geometry and the sheer number of enemy guards, the game becomes a lot more manageable once you realize exactly how limited each guard's viewing range truly is. Realistically, the logistics of some of these sneaking scenarios would be completely impractical. Snake is impossibly good at remaining undetected, and that's because guards can only see directly in front of their faces a single pixel wide. This means you can essentially dance right in an enemy's periphery and remain completely safe as long as you never cross directly in front of their eyeline. Like, check out this screen, for instance. At first glance, this may seem like an impossible ordeal, and indeed, if you hesitate for even a second, you'll be spotted. But by knowing how guards work, and by acting quickly, you'll be able to duck down into this corner here and inexplicably remain completely unseen despite being surrounded. And in general, the game does do a pretty good job of keeping you from walking straight into enemy lines. Knowing that the game wouldn't be able to scroll and that each screen would need to be rendered one by one, the level design is pretty generous about providing an immediate source of cover upon entering each screen. At least for the first half of the game or so. Later on, there are a few instances where a new screen will plop you right into a guard's view, triggering an alert before you've even had time to orient yourself or register what's happened. And while it is true that by that point you're likely to have the cardboard box, which acts as a portable hiding spot, it hardly seems like very organic or engaging gameplay to have to enter every screen with the box already equipped. Although I suppose that is kind of a genius bit of visual comedy now that I think about it. And this isn't the only instance of a mid-game difficulty spike. Early on, level design drives the game forward pretty well, with everything you need being placed in a way that guides you through the game without needing to constantly hold your hand. But later on, things get a bit more haphazard and slapdash, with a lot of vital items placed in obtuse, out-of-the-way locations without communicating to the player how important those items are until the player already needs them. Things like the Scorpion Antidote or the rocket launcher, for instance. There's also the way the game handles the final boss. You need no less than 16 pieces of plastic explosive to defeat Metal Gear. The game tells you this, but it does not tell you that you need to have the highest rank in order for this to be possible, as a 3-star soldier can only hold 15. Nor does the game tell you that you'll need to stock up beforehand, since there is no plastic explosive in the building Metal Gear is in. There are also a few instances of instant death in this game, namely trap floors, and the tank and bulldozer bosses can also one-hit kill you. But despite all this, I don't actually see Metal Gear as being an overly difficult game. That's largely because it's actually surprisingly forgiving compared to other 80s action games. Saving can be done at any time with no consequence, and even if you haven't saved, checkpoints are placed very generously. Dying and continuing usually only sets you back a few screens, which is a lot friendlier than the way other games of the era did things, where each game over could potentially mean hours of lost progress. I will say, though, the way you have to scroll through every keycard you have at every locked door because the keycards don't stack is a really dumb design decision, and I just wanted to point that out because the game has you do that so fucking much. And since this is Metal Gear, I of course have to talk about the story, right? Well, despite the franchise's reputation in its later years, the first Metal Gear kind of barely has a story. Snake infiltrates Outer Heaven, he finds Gray Fox, who informs him about Metal Gear. He rescues Metal Gear's developer, who tells him Metal Gear's weak point, and then he destroys Metal Gear. There's exactly one plot twist, wherein it's revealed that Big Boss, your commanding officer, was actually the leader of Outer Heaven and was working against the US government the whole time, which is why he sent in a lone unarmed rookie on this high-end infiltration mission. Snake was actually expected to fail, but against all odds, didn't. In all fairness, this is still a lot more substance than game plots of the 80s were typically known for, and the twist is actually pretty cleverly hinted at for about an hour leading up to the reveal, including a blatant breaking of the fourth wall that I'm sure was a revolutionary bit of writing for games of the era. Big Boss directly ordering the player to turn off their console as a last-ditch effort for Snake to fail his mission is equal parts creepy and hilarious, not to mention some pretty avant-garde metatextual storytelling. It's also interesting that unlike later games in the series, Metal Gear is entirely self-contained in its lore and setting, without tying in any sort of real-world politics or historical events. It's just a dumb, cheesy war game meant to evoke the dumb, cheesy war movies that Kojima loves. And it does a pretty good job of that. Now, since the MSX2 wasn't released in America, this version of Metal Gear is not the one Americans got. A port of the game for the NES was developed by a separate Konami division, without any supervision from the original staff, and under a strict 3-month deadline. And, it shows. The NES game is a pretty shoddy adaptation, with new areas that aren't designed nearly as elegantly, and the layout of the game is rearranged without much thought, resulting in a few instances where the player sees story scenes out of order. You never even fight Metal Gear in this version. Kojima's MSX version is considered the true version of the game, and that's not just the fanboys whining about things. The NES version is kind of a broken game by comparison, and Kojima himself has renounced it as being far below his standards. That being said, I was still pleasantly surprised to see that this version of the game will be included in the upcoming Master Collection, simply because the NES version hasn't been ported in about 20 years, not since the Japanese release of Twin Snakes in 2003, and much longer than that everywhere else. Europe did see a shoddily translated release of the MSX version of Metal Gear, but American players wouldn't be able to play it at all until 2005, when it was included along with its sequel in Metal Gear Solid 3 Subsistence, which is the version you've been seeing in this video. This one was based on a Japanese mobile phone port of the game, adapted for standard controllers and with a greatly improved localization. Most MGS3 re-releases kept this inclusion, meaning the MSX version has actually been the much more readily available of the two for quite some time. Despite being a bit of a trailblazer in the world of game design, Metal Gear didn't exactly take the world by storm. It was fairly successful in North America, selling over 1 million copies, but for most everywhere else, being released for a region-specific console directly competing with big-name Nintendo products meant that it flew under the radar for most people, and most of the Americans that played it on Nintendo hardware were unknowingly playing an inferior port. Metal Gear is one of those games that gained most of its praise in retrospect, done a huge favor by the legacy its sequels managed to create. That being said, in a vacuum, would it still be worth playing? I say yes, at least for a few hours. There's a lot of interesting things here, but by the back half of the game it becomes clear that the developers started rushing to get it out the door. The immaculately paced opening half of the game eventually caves in on itself, leading to a second half that feels like it could have used a lot of fine-tuning. But it's definitely not as horribly sadistic as a lot of other 80s games. And at the end of the day, Metal Gear is the best kind of pioneer, the kind that began from humble origins. The year is 19XX. Capcom decides that they need to advance more into the console market with an original title, not just ports of their arcade games. Street Fighter had just been released in arcades, and a young artist who had worked on the title, Keiji Inafune, was tasked with working on their new project, then known as Mighty Kid. Inafune, or NF King as he would be known, was one of only 6 people working on the project, a fitting number in retrospect. Inspiration was drawn from sources such as Astro Boy, Santa Claus, Albert Einstein, and American comics, and the naming motif also became based on music. Mighty Kid became the hero known as Rockman. This was further reinforced with the rock-paper-scissors style of gameplay that became the core of the game, leading Rockman to be a very simple but thematic and meaningful name. So naturally, when the game made it overseas to America, the title got changed to something more cool, and so that's how Rockman became and how this great art became. The plot of Mega Man is fairly simple. In the far-off year of 2000X, a bunch of robots made by Dr. Thomas Light go on a rampage due to his rival, Dr. Albert Wily. The strongest 6 of these robots are the Robot Masters, consisting of Bomb Man, Guts Man, Cut Man, Elect Man, Ice Man, and Fire Man. Dr. Light's personal assistant, the aforementioned Rock, volunteers to be upgraded and becomes in order to stop these threats, and then attack Dr. Wily in his fortress and stop his nefarious plan. Mega Man is a side-scrolling platformer that lets you choose the order of the stages, and while not the very first game to introduce this concept, it was very much still a novel idea at the time. Each level requires some navigation, as well as shooting enemies and obstacles in your path, and each of the 6 initial levels ends with a fight against a Robot Master. Once defeated, you're granted a special weapon related to the Robot Master's abilities. You also get points for every enemy and boss you take out, but that's purely for clout. Controls are somewhat limited. You can only fire straight ahead, you cannot crouch, and you have limited ammo for all weapons that aren't the standard Mega Buster, and your ammo also doesn't refill upon death. Mega Man's jump and movement feel responsive though, and once you learn enemy patterns and have some strong firepower, the game really starts to ease up. I am of course joking, the game only gets worse from there. Despite only being 6 levels to start from, there are a total of 720 different routes you can take. Now that sounds horribly daunting, but remember when I mentioned rock, paper, scissors earlier? That comes into play pretty heavily in this game and makes most paths frustratingly unviable. While every Robot Master and Wily boss can be defeated with the standard Mega Buster, this will turn the fights into nightmarish duels. Each Robot Master is weak to the special weapon of another Robot Master, and it's very easy to follow the path. Bomb Man beats Guts Man because bombs blow up rocks. Guts Man beats Cut Man because rock beats scissors. Cut Man beats Elect Man because scissors typically have rubber grips, and rubber has very high electrical resistance, I guess, ignoring the fact that scissors are metallic and therefore would have low resistance, so Elecman beats Iceman because ice is frozen water and water has low electrical resistance. By that logic, Iceman beats Fireman because fire melts ice, but then ice becomes water and puts out fire, so that's thermodynamics. And finally, Fireman beats Bombman because fire ignites bombs. See? Easy path. I feel like pointing out that that previous paragraph was written by my co-writer, who has a chemistry degree. Unfortunately, the weapons you get from the Robot Masters are sort of a mixed bag, a curse that will continue to plague many entries across every continuity of Mega Man. Hyper Bomb takes way too long to explode to ever be useful, Super Arm can only be used if there are blocks to throw in the first place, and all but 2 bosses are immune to Ice Slasher, despite it being useful in getting to said bosses. Which is a shame because, as I've said earlier, this game is hard. Each stage has its own gimmicks, and some are particularly infamous, like Gutsman's stage and the series of moving platforms that give out on you, sending you immediately into a bottomless pit. Or the footholders in Iceman's stage that move at random and fire projectiles from side to side that will also send you into a bottomless pit. There are 8 of these living platforms in sequence. Do yourself a favor, save the headaches, and just do what the pro gamers do. Use the magnet beam to skip the whole thing. Oh, and speaking of the magnet beam, I sure hope you fought Gutsman before Elecman and used Super Arm on some blocks to get the magnet beam. Otherwise, you won't be able to progress through the first level of Dr. Wily's factory, and you'll have to redo a stage you already completed just to get the magnet beam. Enemies can also do frightening levels of damage, with some, like the Big Eye, doing about a third of your health in damage just by touching it. And this isn't even talking about the difficulty of the bosses themselves, let alone the fact that Wily's Factory is a 4-stage gauntlet with new original bosses and all 6 of the Robot Masters, 4 of which you have to fight in a row. And worst of all, this entire game has to be done in one sitting, because for whatever reason, despite offering unlimited continues, there is no save system or password system. It may seem like I'm complaining about this game a lot, but it is still a good game and a pivotal piece of game development. It's clearly rough and unpolished, but this was the start of a series that now has over 130 titles and counting. And hopefully one day one of those entries will be Mega Man Legends 3. Please? Please? And this first entry established much of the design blueprint for future games, like the rock, paper, scissors gameplay, the level select, the endgame gauntlets, diverse weapons, useless weapons, disappearing blocks, fighting every Robot Master twice, and wild difficulty spikes. If you like the Mega Man series, it's still worth a try, but be prepared to struggle. But for newcomers, you could just start with Mega Man 2 or 3 and be just fine. I should also mention, since I don't own the game and thus won't be covering it later, that a remake called Mega Man Powered Up was released in 2006 for the PSP, which did add 2 new Robot Masters, Time Man and the unfortunately designed Oil Man, and updated gameplay including charge shots, sliding, and so forth. It also added a reward for defeating a Robot Master with the Mega Buster, in that said Robot Master would then become a playable character. Roll and Proto Man were also playable, bringing the total number of playable characters to 11. And there were 2 styles of gameplay, one in the classic NES style, and one with voice acting, adjustable difficulty, and character-exclusive routes. Unfortunately, sales of the remake were quite poor despite glowing reviews, which can probably be attributed to being released on the PSP instead of the DS juggernaut. Sales were so low that the planned Mega Man 2 remake of this style was indefinitely cancelled, which is a real shame. So if you don't like struggling and have a PSP available, you can try and track this one down, or just get the Legacy Collection, which added save states. That works too.